Now we have gathered the information from the user and we have their date of birth, it's time to display that information to the screen. The point of this application is to display some information about the user's date of birth, how old they are, how many days they've lived, things like that. So in this lesson, we're going to take a look at understanding that data, formatting the data and presenting it to the user in a human readable way. So this will include some calculations to work out things like how many days they've been alive, as well as string formatting to format dates into a certain way, whether we want to spell out the month or display the month as a number, things like that. This will be the final step to this application, and hopefully we will complete it in this lesson. So let's dive in and take a look at presenting all the information about the user's date of birth. Our program up to this point in time now asks the user for their date of birth. Once we have this date of birth, we do nothing with it. But the point of this application is to display something about their date of birth, some useful information. So what we want to do next is announce the information about the date of birth. We made this method here with the purpose of asking the user for their date of birth. It's a good idea to make methods that have a single purpose, in this case to ask the user for their date of birth. We could now write directly in the main method here and output information about the user's date of birth directly in line, but it's a good idea to put that functionality in another method, so that that method has the responsibility of announcing the information. For one, this can then be reused if we needed to reuse it in future, and two, it keeps the code blocks smaller. So the main method becomes smaller and easier to read, that we are asking the user for the date of birth, and then we are announcing it, and then we are doing something else. Instead of putting all this code from this method directly into the main method, and then doing something with this information after, this method then becomes multi-purpose, longer and harder to read. It's not always the case that you need to do this, but it's almost always the case. You should always separate your code into small blocks that are easier to understand, manage and read, as well as reuse. So with that in mind, let's make one more function. Let me just minimize these other methods for now. We'll make a new method here. This time we won't return anything because we are displaying content to the user and we need to give no information back to the method. For that reason, we will put void, and the method we will call announce date of birth information. In order to do anything with that information, we need the date of birth. So we will have a single parameter of a date time offset, and we will call it date. Now we know about commenting, let's go ahead and comment this method. Now we have defined the signature. And this method's purpose is to display information to the user about the given date of birth. The parameter here, date, is the date of birth to display information about. So what is the first piece of information we could display for a date of birth? I would say when you were born. Let's redisplay the information they've given us. So once they type in their date of birth, let's display that in another format. So for this, we want to say display date of birth. And we can write console.writeLine, or we can write CW and press tab twice as a quick hand way of writing console.writeLine. We'll use string interpolation by opening up the $ before the quotes. And we will write, so you were born on, open the curly braces, and we can now use this date given, and that's what we want to display. However, passing in just the date into the string interpolation will simply format the date under its default conversion. We are not controlling what we want to display. If we want to format a date in a specific style, we can put a colon and now specify a string format after the colon. For a date of birth, the format can have a lowercase d for the days, uppercase m for the months, and lowercase y's for the years. The number of d's, m's, and y's that we use dictate what comes out. You can experiment with this, or you can look up the official documentation for date time string formats for C#. For now, if we put 1d, 3 uppercase m's, and 4 lowercase y's, this will result in a year of 4 digits, so 2020. If we were to put 2 y's, it would be the last 2 digits, so 20 in this case, or 19 for last year. The uppercase m's, with 3, it will display a 3-letter of the month. So for March, it would be MAR, and the single D will simply display the day of the month without any excess zeros. If we were to put 2 Ds, it would always format the day with 2 digits. So by doing this, we will see the date of birth displayed as the day, then the month as a short-term word, and then the year. Let's call this method and see this happening. So in main, we simply need to say announce date of birth information and pass in the user date of birth. Let's run this application with F5 and let's enter the 3rd of the 3rd, 20. And now you can see it says you were born on the 3rd of March 2020, or in this case the 3rd of MAR. Let's say we want the full month, we can put an extra M, so now it's 4 digits. If we run the code again and enter the 3rd of the 3rd, 20, you can see now it displays the full month name. So let's leave it at that for now. That's how we will display their date of birth. Next, another useful thing, and the original point of this application, was to display the day of the week they were born. You might think this is very complicated to work out. However, luckily, the date time offset has a built-in function called day of week. So we simply have to display that. Let's type console.writeLine and say that was A, and then pass out the date dot. And if you see, we have lots of information in this date. One of is including day of week, day of year, time of day. So what we want is the day of week. And as the IntelliSense mentions, it gets the day of the week from this date. So that will be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, based on the actual date they were born on. So it's that simple. So we will say display day of the week they were born. Let's run it again and see. And let's put in, say, the 3rd of the 3rd, 1980. And that day was a Monday. So that's some really useful information and quite a cool little feature. And as you can see, it's actually a built-in functionality to the date time offset type. So beyond the day of the week they were born and their date of birth, what other information can we display? I say we display how many days it is until their next birthday. So in order to do that, we need to first work out when their next birthday is. To be able to work out days nice and easy, we want to create another date time offset for their next birthday. For example, if I was born on the 3rd of March, the year is irrelevant because we want the next birthday. So the year will either be this year or next year. It would be this year if we were in January and we hadn't reached March. But if we were in June, then the birthday is actually the year following. So one thing we need to work out is, have we passed the birthday for this current year? So are we past the birthday for this year? Let's take it one step at a time and work that out. So make a comment, indicate if we have already passed the user's date of birth for the current year. We'll call it past birthday, or let's be a little bit better, has passed birthday. So what do we need to do for this? Well, firstly, we need today's date. That's easy enough again, using datetime offset.now. I like to use UTC now because now is relevant to the current time zone of this machine. So to keep it simple, I always like to go to UTC, so we always have the same point in time. UTC always uses the universal time date instead of the time zone. So you have to consider when working with dates to not use the local time, the non-UTC time, unless you actually need to. Otherwise, you can end up with date time issues that you will find out later on. So we will use the time UTC now, which is the time right now in UTC. If you're interested to see what this is, let's just put a semicolon, a breakpoint here, run the application, enter a date of birth, and inspect the locals window. And as we can see, the current time is the 6th of the 6th, 2020 at 8:40 in the morning. I'm on UK time and we're currently 1 hour ahead, so it's actually 9:40. But you can see the UTC here will be the same right now if run anywhere in the world on any time zone. On the other hand, if we just go to the immediate window and type date time offset .now, you can see it outputs 9:41, not 8:41. So this is local to UK time. So we know we have the current date time right now. So all we need to know is if the current day of the year, for example, from 1 to 365 in general, is it past the current day of the year now? Again, a really useful feature of date time offset is we have that information. We have day of year. So this will be for the 1st of January, the number 1. For the 1st of February, this would be 32 because there are 31 days in January. So this is a nice way to tell if the current day of the year is past the user's day of the year, meaning we have passed their birthday. So we simply say, is the day of year right now greater than the date we were given day of year? So we are simply comparing the user's birthday, ignoring the year and just checking the day of the year we are in, if we have passed that date. If so, we have passed the user's birthday. We can validate this again if we put a breakpoint and run the code. We're on the 6th of the 6th right now, so let's enter the 1st of the 1st, 80, and we can see the logic is true. We have passed the day of the year. If we hover over UTC now, we can see the current day of the year is 158. So the 6th of the 6th, 2020 is the 158th day of this year. And the birthday should be 1 because we entered the 1st of the 1st, 1980. Let's run that code again. And this time let's enter December. So the 12th of the 12th, 80. This time it's correctly false. So we know our logic is working. We have now detected if we have passed the birthday, and we can use this variable in the calculations to come. So the step we wanted to do was display how long until next birthday. So just before we can do that, we need more information. We need a datetime offset object that represents when the user's next birthday is, including the year, so we can do a subtraction and work out the days left. It's not as simple as just calculating 365 minus the days, because every year is different. We could have a leap year, for example. So it's good to use the datetime offset objects because they handle all the quirks of date times. So what we need to do is create a new datetime offset object that represents the user's next date of birth. If we haven't passed their date of birth yet, we want the year to be this year and the day and the month to be from the date passed in. If we have passed their date of birth, then it will be next year. So we want it to be next year's date plus the day and the month in the user's date. That should make sense if you think about it. So let's now create a new object that represents the user's next birthday. So we will say get a date representing the user's next birthday. We will call this next birthday. And as we mentioned, we want a new datetime offset object. You can create this using the word new. We will cover this in future lessons. but for now, just simply type new datetime offset and open parentheses. If I press F12 on the datetime offset, you can see we have a bunch of constructors here, which is what we are calling. Don't worry too much about that for now. But you can understand here, to create a datetime offset, we can pass in the year, the month, the day, the hour, the minute, the second, and the offset. That is the call we want to use because we need to specify the year, the month, and the day. But there is no constructor that only accepts year, month, and day. It wants everything else. So we will just blank out the hour, minute, second, and time span. I will cover classes which will then cover constructors and what is happening here. But for now, just know that you can create a new datetime offset and pass in something like 2020 12 1 to represent the 1st of December 2020. And then we need to pass in an hour, a minute, a second, and a time span, which is the span from that date. We can pass in timespan.0. So doing this would create a new datetime offset representing the 12th of December 2020 at 0 hours, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds. But what we wanted, as we mentioned, is to pass in the month and the day of the date of birth. So let's first replace the month with the month contained inside the actual user's date of birth, and the day in the date of birth. And now all that's left is to represent the current year or the year after if we have passed the birthday. So if we weren't bothered about checking if we had passed the birthday, we could simply say datetimeoffset.utcnow.year. This would give us 2020 and the user's date of birth. So that will give us their date of birth this year. Let's run that and see. I will enter the 3rd of the 3rd, 80. And you can see our next birthday is the 3rd of the 3rd, 2020. So we are halfway there. All we need to do now is mention if we have passed the date of birth this year, their next birthday is +1. It's the current year +1. We can do that in line simply by stating +1, but then we want to replace this logic here instead of 1 with a check. There are two ways to do this. One would be to simply say the next birthday is a time date offset, and then use an if statement to say if has passed birthday, next birthday is equal to the year +1 and all the other information. Otherwise, the next birthday is equal to this year. So this is the logic we could use, and this is the easier to understand when you are getting started. So hopefully you understand what's going on here. We check if their birthday is this year or not. If it should be next year, then we create a new date time representing next year with the user's month and day from their birthday. Otherwise, it represents this year. But there's a much shorter way so that we don't have to duplicate all this code just to change this one value here. You can also see the if statement is saying it can be simplified with show potential fixes, and it's already recommending this option. Now this still isn't shorthand. All this has done is combined the if statement to basically say in line, if this variable is true, and that's what this question mark means, it means the thing on the left of the question mark, if this was on the same line, if this is true, question mark, do this bit of code. Followed by a semicolon, which is the else, do this. So really, all we have done is rewritten that code in a slightly shorter way. So instead of if and else, we have done a question mark and colon to split up the if. So instead of if, we delete this, put question mark, and we can put this on this side because it's always being assigned. There's the if, and then instead of a semicolon, we place a colon, delete the else, and place this. So that's all we have done. It's another way of saying if else. However, there's a better way of doing both of these. Using that same principle of the question mark and colon, meaning if and else, we can shorten this right back, use the var, place this back where it was, and now we simply want to do the if and else in line instead of just saying 1. This needs to be 0 if we haven't passed the date of birth, and 1 if we have. When we are doing an inline if statement, we can wrap it in parentheses to make sure the logic doesn't get confused with this plus symbol. And we can now say has passed date of birth question mark. So this means if we have passed the date of birth, what do we want to return outside of these parentheses to this expression here? So the expression is expecting the year, which is an integer, plus an integer. So this is expecting to return something. When we do the question mark and colon, it always returns a value. So whatever is placed in the question mark here will be returned when this is true. So if we have passed the date of birth, we want it to be 1 to add 1 to the year. After that, place a colon, which means else, and then we place a 0. So what this little statement here does is say, if this value is true, return 1. Otherwise, return 0. So if we take that logic with the overall expression here, we end up with saying the year, or this overall value passed into the method, would be the year plus 0 if this was false, or plus 1 if this was true. You can think of this easy as well, and to test your knowledge by simply going var a equals true question mark 1 colon 0. This, for example, would say a is going to equal, if this is true, which is always 1, otherwise 0. We can check that with a breakpoint, run the code, type any birthday, and inspect the result of A in the locals window being 1. We could also use this immediate window and just write true question mark 1 colon 0. And we have evaluated this statement and the result is 1. Let's say false question mark 1 colon 0 and it evaluates to 0. So you can play with this immediate window if you want to run some expressions. We could also say, for example, if 5 is less than 4 question mark 1 colon 0. And because 5 is not less than 4, it is 0. You are not limited to what you return. You simply have to return something. So just because we returned a number there, we could have easily returned a string, saying 5 is less than 4, 5 is less than 4, and on false, return another string, 5 is greater than 4. And you can see it then returns the string 5 is greater than 4. So between looking at the locals window, the immediate window, and what you have learned here, hopefully these little statements make sense. It's simply shorthand ways to inline if and else logic to allow you to write shorter and concise code. So instead of having to repeat ourselves with the next birthday equaling a date time offset and repeating all of this information, we can instead inline it to show a really nice and simple logic here and give us the answer we want. So now let's check if we get what we want. We expect the next birthday to be this year if we have not passed the date, and next year if we have. Let's run the code again, enter the 3rd of the 3rd 80, and we can see the next birthday has been given the 3rd of the 3rd 21. That is because we have passed the 3rd of the 3rd. So the next birthday is correct. It will be next year. Let's run the code again and enter the 12th of December. and we can see the correct assumption of the next birthday is this year, the 12th of December. So we now have the knowledge of whether we have passed the birthday and also when the next birthday is represented as a date-time offset. This makes all the further calculations really simple. So let's finally display how many days it is until the user's next birthday. Display how many days until the next birthday. And to do this, we write a console.writeLine, and we can say it is, and then so many days until your next birthday. And what we want to display in here is a simple case of saying the next birthday minus the current time. So DateTimeOffset.UTC-now. The DateTime offsets have another really useful feature, being able to subtract one from another and give us another type called a time span that represents a length of time. If we put parentheses around this expression, we can now access the result of this without having to place it in a variable. Let's first start by placing this in a variable so you can see what is going on. For time to next birthday equals this. If we hover over the variable, you can see it is now a time span. We could then do time to next birthday dot and access the properties of this type. And we have the options total milliseconds, total seconds, days, hours, milliseconds, minutes, seconds, various things. So what we are interested in is total days. So we could say in here, it is time to next birthday dot total days until your next birthday. As we have seen before, if we are not reusing this variable anywhere, we can simply inline it here. Because the variable comes from the result of an expression, something minus something else, we can't just place this in here, because then this period is acting on this object, not the result of this expression. So to inline this, we place parentheses around the expression, and now this becomes the equivalent of this variable. We can now access the properties of the result of this expression, the returned value. Again, hopefully that makes sense. If not, use the old method until you're comfortable understanding that placing parentheses in line gives the result of the expression. Similar to here, we place parentheses around this expression because this expression returns 1 or 0. If we removed the parentheses, it will complain that we can't apply plus to an integer and a boolean, because the way the code works is it tries to evaluate this statement first and then do an if on the result of this statement. So to help the compiler understand the code and do it in the correct order, we place parentheses around this expression so this gets evaluated on its own and its result then gets merged into this expression. This may be a little hard to grasp now, but you will soon get used to this. Play around in code until you're comfortable of what the parentheses do when in line, and the fact that you can always take something inside of parentheses, cut it, place it into a variable, and then replace the parentheses with the name of the variable. That will work in any situation. So if you think of it like that, it's easier to understand. We could take this parentheses, cut it out, place it in a variable, and replace the parentheses with the variable name. Now when you read the code, it's easier to understand that the variable a is an integer and that this is an if-else statement, and then we are simply adding an integer to an integer. It's always good to think of things in a way you know and how to convert between the old way and the new way. I would write it in the new way because this is a clean way of writing that makes your code more dry and you don't have to repeat yourself as much. But if you are not comfortable yet understanding this code, it's more important to understand your own code before you start using ways of code that you don't understand. Let's run this code again and see how many days it is until the next birthday. Let's use the third of the third 80. And you can see it is 269.62 lots of digits days until your birthday. Now this isn't a very nice way of representing days. Instead, we only really care about the most significant numbers. We don't care about the floating point numbers because we don't want a partial day. As you saw here, when we use string interpolation with the $sign, when we pass in a variable inside the curly braces, we can use the colon and then pass in a string to format the data. We can use the same technique to format these total days into a single integer. So we want to strip out all the floating point numbers. To do that, place a colon after the value inside of the curly braces and just use a single 0. This will convert the result into an integer without any floating point numbers. Whenever we do this though, whenever we use a string format, we cannot have spaces before the closing curly brace. This is because part of this string can contain spaces such as this. So it needs to know after the colon when to end. If we do this then, I like to generally remove the trailing space from the start as well, so it looks even. If we run this code now and enter the same date of birth, you can see it says it's 270 days until your next birthday. And it's rounded up the 269.6 up to the most significant figure 270. So that's formatting an integer into a single digit. We will take a look at string formats for various pieces of information in a separate lesson. But for now, the 0 simply means it will display a digit always. If we place 4 zeros, for example, then it will always display 4 digits. So if there is no fourth digit because the number is less, it will display a 0. If it's greater than 4 digits, it would simply continue to display the numbers. The zeros represent the minimum number of digits to display. Another piece of useful information is the user's age. So how old is the person? So get the user's age, user age, and we can work this out again. We have all the information we need now to work all this out. So we can use the datetime_offset.utc now. And you can notice we are using this statement over and over, datetime_offset.utc. And every time we call it, it is the current time at that point in time. So if the code runs here at 1 minute past 1, and then the code runs here at a second later, these two values are different. So to potentially stop that, as well as to simply not repeat ourselves, let's first take this datetime_offset.utc now and store it in a variable at the start. And we can say store current time. And we'll just say now. Then we can change everywhere we used datetime_offset.utc now to the variable now. This makes our code shorter and less repetitive. And if we wanted to change the variable now throughout this calculation, we only have to change it in one place. So back to the user's age. To work that out, we need the year that we are currently in minus the year they were born, but we also need to take into account whether we have passed their birthday or not. If we have passed their birthday, then we don't need to subtract any more. If we haven't yet passed the birthday, then we need to subtract an additional 1. That is because if you were born in 2010 and it's now 2020, but you haven't passed your birthday yet, you would be 9. So right now, 2020 minus 2010 is 10. But if you are not past your birthday, you are 9. So we need to subtract an additional 1 if we have passed the birthday. We can do the same thing again and inline this. We do minus, open some parentheses, and check again, have we passed the birthday? If true, we don't subtract any more. If false, meaning we haven't yet passed their birthday, subtract an extra 1. So again, this is like saying, take this variable, take this expression on its own. Have we passed the birthday? True. So if we have passed the birthday, return 0. If this is false, return 1. So this should give us the user's age. Let's then display that. Display user's age. You are years old. And let's check that out. Let's press F5. Let's enter the 1st of the 1st, 2010. And you can see because we have passed the 1st of the 1st, it's saying we are 10. If we run the code again, and this time enter 12th of the 12th, 2010, it's correctly saying we are 9 years old. So this is now working. Let's also, for fun, display the user's age in dog years. Let's copy and paste. Change it to dog years. And dog years is simply times 7. So we take the user's age times 7. And lastly, let's figure out how long the user has been alive, and then display a whole bunch of information like the hours, minutes, days, seconds of how long they've been alive. Let's say get user's time alive. And this is really easy. Just take now minus the date of birth. This, as we know from before, will give us a time span, and this will simply now represent the time span of how long the user has been alive. Let's write out how long the user has been alive. You are so many days old. So display days old. This can be time alive, and as we've seen before, we have total days. Let's just copy and paste these lines. We'll have days, hours, and seconds. Whenever you copy and paste code, make sure you really check all the code that you've copied and don't glance over it. And make sure we change every part we need to. Oh, that should be total seconds, not seconds. And now if we enter a date of birth 3rd of the 3rd, 80, you can see we now get, we are 14,705 days old. We are 352,000 hours old. And then when we get to seconds, it's very hard to figure out because there's no separators between the digits. And we also don't want this surplus floating point number. So let's just fix that firstly. We know how to fix the floating point numbers. We simply do :0. So that will get rid of all the superfluous information in the number we don't care about. We just want an integer. But we also really want separators. So when we have long numbers, such as this, there's standard ways, and it varies based on your culture, of where you have the separators. So in the UK, we have a comma after every 3rd digit to break it up. Because we want this to be represented to the user in their current culture format, so it's in a number format that's relevant to them, we could actually use N0. The N in the string format refers to the standard numerical formatting. Again, we will cover formatting more as we go along, but what this does is simply formats this value in the way that a number would be presented for this current machine's culture. So in this case, this is on UK English, so this will display these numbers in a format that's standard for English number formatting. Let's see what that does so you understand. You can see now it's separated the number in the way that the English represent long numbers, which is the same for most cultures, but other things vary, such as currency symbols and other things. So when we use the N, it will make sure that the number is represented in a format that's relevant for numbers on this local machine. So with that, this application is complete. It's a very simple application. We ask the user for their date of birth, and we display a whole host of information about that date of birth. All the code is commented. It's split into methods the way I would split it. And we just need one more comment here. Announce information about date. So really, this is a complete application. You have now made your first application. This last lesson has covered a lot in one go, but it's also good to start getting into the more complicated formatting and syntax all in one go, so you can go ahead and test yourself. As this is a milestone in the lessons, I will now formulate a test where you can now create an application and submit your results, and I will grade you on how well you have done. You will have to remember everything about what you have done from the start to the finish of each lesson, and construct a new application with something you should be able to do with the knowledge you currently have. Next, we will move on to something very exciting and start learning more about C#. But this is your first milestone, so you should feel proud, and you should also go back and make sure you understand every lesson, ready for the final chapter test.